Welcome to Sinister Memory. If you're new here, subscribe now and let us know in the comments where you're listening to this story. Let's get to today's story. The yellowed pages of the Beauregard Parish Courthouse records, discovered during renovations in 1923, contained entries that local historians would later describe as disturbing anomalies in an otherwise mundane collection of antebellum documentation. Among property transfers and tax assessments, a series of medical examiner reports from the winter of 1862 stood out like bloodstains on pristine cotton. Dr. Jeremiah Rousseau, the parish's only qualified physician during those turbulent months, had documented cases that defied both medical understanding and human comprehension. The plantation known as Magnolia Bend stretched across 3,000 acres of Louisiana's most fertile soil, its boundaries marked by ancient cypress trees that seemed to lean inward, as if protecting or concealing the secrets within. The estate had belonged to the Beaumont family for 4 generations, each patriarch adding to its wealth through the cultivation of sugarcane and the systematic exploitation of human bondage. By 1862, as the Confederate cause began its inexorable decline, Magnolia Bend housed nearly 200 enslaved souls, their quarters arranged in neat rows behind the imposing Greek Revival mansion that dominated the landscape like a white sepulchre. Silas Beaumont, the plantation's current master, had inherited more than land and property from his forebears. The family's reputation for cruelty had been whispered about in New Orleans drawing rooms for decades, though such conversations invariably ceased when Beaumont business interests were mentioned. The war had only intensified these tendencies, as economic pressures and the constant threat of Union advancement created an atmosphere of paranoia and violence that permeated every aspect of plantation life. The overseer's position at Magnolia Bend had proven difficult to fill in recent years. 3 men had held the role between 1859 and 1861, each departing under circumstances that remained deliberately vague in official records. The most recent, a German immigrant named Klaus Brenner, had simply vanished one October morning, leaving behind only a half-finished breakfast and a journal filled with increasingly erratic entries about shadows that moved independently of their sources and voices that called from empty rooms. Into this vacuum stepped Josiah Crane, a man whose credentials seemed impeccable despite his mysterious origins. His letters of recommendation bore impressive seals from plantations across Georgia and South Carolina, though subsequent investigations would reveal that several of these estates had burned during Sherman's march, taking their records with them. Crane presented himself as a methodical administrator with innovative approaches to labor management, and his initial results appeared to justify Beaumont's confidence in his appointment. The enslaved population of Magnolia Bend had developed their own intricate social structures over generations of forced cohabitation. Among these was the practice of informal marriage ceremonies, conducted in secret and blessed by elderly women who served as spiritual leaders within the community. These unions, while lacking legal recognition, provided emotional stability and cultural continuity in an environment designed to strip away human dignity. The plantation's quarters buzzed with quiet celebration when such ceremonies occurred, representing rare moments of joy in lives otherwise defined by suffering. Celeste had arrived at Magnolia Bend in the spring of 1861, part of a group of 20 individuals purchased from a failing plantation near Baton Rouge. Her beauty was remarkable even by the standards of a community that had produced many striking individuals, but it was her intelligence and quiet strength that truly distinguished her from others. She possessed an unusual ability to read and write, skills that she carefully concealed from the white inhabitants of the plantation, while using them to help her fellow enslaved people navigate the complex web of rules and regulations that governed their existence. The informal marriage between Celeste and Thomas, a skilled carpenter who had earned a measure of respect even from the plantation's white overseers, had been planned for months. Their union represented hope for a community that had little reason for optimism, and preparations for the ceremony had proceeded with unusual enthusiasm despite the need for secrecy. The couple had even managed to secure a small cabin at the edge of the quarters, a privilege typically reserved for the most trusted workers. Dr. Rousseau's first entry regarding events at Magnolia Bend was dated December 15, 1862. His handwriting, typically precise and measured, showed signs of agitation as he described being summoned to examine what he termed an incident of unprecedented barbarity. The physician's notes indicated that he had been called to the plantation at dawn, finding the entire enslaved population gathered in the central courtyard under armed guard, their faces reflecting a terror that seemed to transcend normal human fear. The doctor's examination revealed evidence of violence so systematic and deliberate that he struggled to find appropriate medical terminology to describe his findings. His report concluded with an observation that would haunt subsequent readers. The perpetrator had demonstrated anatomical knowledge that suggested either medical training or extensive previous experience with human dissection. The marriage ceremony had taken place 3 days before Dr. Rousseau's arrival, conducted in the traditional manner that had sustained the enslaved community through decades of oppression. Elder Ruth, a woman whose age remained uncertain but whose wisdom commanded universal respect, had presided over the union between Celeste and Thomas in the small clearing behind the sugar mill, where ancient oak trees formed a natural cathedral. The couple had exchanged vows by moonlight, their hands bound with strips of cloth torn from garments that had been worn by previous generations of married couples within the community. Josiah Crane had observed the preparations for this ceremony with an interest that initially appeared benevolent. The new overseer had made several comments to Silas Beaumont about the importance of maintaining morale among the enslaved population, particularly during wartime when the threat of rebellion loomed large in the minds of plantation owners throughout the South. His suggestion that such unions be formally recognized rather than merely tolerated had impressed Beaumont as evidence of progressive thinking that might improve productivity while maintaining discipline. The cabin assigned to the newlywed couple stood at the northeastern edge of the quarters, positioned where the cultivated fields met the encroaching wilderness of cypress swamps and Spanish moss. This location, while offering a degree of privacy that was rare within the plantation's rigid social structure, also placed the dwelling beyond the immediate sight of the main house and the other slave quarters. The isolation that had initially seemed like a blessing would prove to be something far more sinister. Thomas had spent weeks preparing their new home, utilizing his carpentry skills to create furniture and decorative elements that transformed the basic structure into something approaching comfort. His fellow workers had contributed materials and labor, understanding that the success of this union represented hope for their own future possibilities. The cabin's interior reflected the community's collective investment in the couple's happiness, with handmade quilts, carved wooden bowls, and even a small mirror that had been secretly acquired through the plantation's informal economy. Crane's behavior in the days following the ceremony had begun to exhibit subtle changes that were noticed first by the enslaved population and only later by the plantation's white inhabitants. His daily inspections of the quarters, previously conducted with business-like efficiency, had become more frequent and seemed to focus disproportionately on the area surrounding the newlyweds' cabin. Workers reported that the overseer would often pause during his rounds to stare at the dwelling with an intensity that made them uncomfortable, though none dared to comment directly on his conduct. The overseer's quarters, located in a substantial brick building between the main house and the slave cabins, had been modified since Crane's arrival in ways that struck the household staff as peculiar. Heavy curtains had been installed over windows that had previously remained uncovered, and deliveries of unusual supplies had arrived from New Orleans with increasing frequency. The domestic servants who cleaned the building reported finding medical instruments and anatomical texts among Crane's possessions, items that seemed incongruous with his stated background in agricultural management. On the night of December 12th, the enslaved community had retired to their quarters with the satisfaction that came from completing another day's labor without incident. The harvest season had ended successfully, despite the disruptions caused by the war, and there was cautious optimism that the winter months might pass without the violence that had characterized recent years. Celeste and Thomas had been seen walking hand in hand toward their cabin as darkness fell, their contentment visible even to casual observers. The first indication that something was amiss came from Sarah, an elderly woman whose cabin stood closest to the newlyweds' dwelling. Her sleep had been disturbed by sounds that she initially attributed to the normal activities of a young married couple. But as the night progressed, these noises had taken on qualities that filled her with inexplicable dread. The sounds seemed to alternate between periods of complete silence and episodes of movement that suggested struggle rather than intimacy. By dawn, when Thomas failed to appear for his assigned duties at the carpentry shop, concern within the community had escalated to alarm. The young man's reliability was legendary among both the enslaved population and the plantation's management, making his absence unprecedented and deeply troubling. When Sarah finally summoned the courage to approach the cabin, she discovered that the door, which should have been secured from within, stood slightly ajar. The scene that greeted her eyes defied comprehension and would haunt her remaining years with visions that no amount of prayer could erase. The cabin's interior, so carefully prepared for a life of shared happiness, had been transformed into something that seemed to belong more to a medical laboratory than a home. The methodical arrangement of what remained suggested a mind that had approached its work with scientific precision and unhurried deliberation. Thomas was found bound to the bed frame with ropes that showed evidence of careful preparation, their placement indicating knowledge of anatomy that went far beyond what any plantation overseer should possess. The condition of his body suggested that he had been kept alive for an extended period while subjected to procedures that served no purpose other than the satisfaction of whoever had performed them. Dr. Rousseau's examination of the cabin revealed evidence that challenged his understanding of human depravity. The physician had served as a field surgeon during the early months of the war, witnessing amputations performed without anesthesia and treating wounds that defied medical intervention, yet nothing in his experience had prepared him for the methodical precision displayed within those four walls. The arrangement of surgical instruments on a makeshift table suggested someone with formal training in anatomical dissection, their placement following protocols typically observed in medical schools rather than the crude improvisations of battlefield medicine. Celeste's fate had been documented with disturbing thoroughness through a series of sketches found pinned to the cabin's walls. These drawings, executed with artistic skill that rivaled medical illustrations, depicted the systematic removal of skin in patterns that followed anatomical landmarks with scientific accuracy. The progression shown in these images indicated that the process had been conducted over several hours, with careful attention paid to maintaining the subject's consciousness throughout the ordeal. Each sketch bore notations in a precise hand, recording observations about tissue response and physiological reactions with the detached objectivity of a research scientist. The bed itself had been modified with restraints that showed evidence of careful planning and construction. Leather straps had been attached to the frame at precise intervals, their positioning calculated to allow maximum access while preventing movement. The mattress bore stains that Dr. Rousseau's analysis would later confirm as human blood, but the patterns suggested controlled bleeding rather than the chaotic spillage associated with violent struggle. Beneath the bed, the physician discovered a collection of glass vials containing what appeared to be preserved tissue samples, each labeled with dates and anatomical designations. Thomas's body presented a different but equally disturbing tableau. His positioning indicated that he had been forced to observe the proceedings involving his wife before becoming a subject himself. The restraints that bound him showed evidence of prolonged struggle, with deep abrasions around his wrists and ankles, suggesting hours of futile resistance. His eyes had been surgically removed with precision that indicated both skill and deliberate cruelty, the empty socket serving as a final mockery of his helplessness to protect the woman he had married just days earlier. The cabin's windows had been covered with heavy cloth that blocked all external light, creating an environment where the perpetrator could work without fear of observation. Candles arranged around the room provided illumination that would have been adequate for detailed work, their placement suggesting familiarity with the requirements of surgical procedures. The floor bore marks indicating that furniture had been moved to create optimal working space, transforming the modest dwelling into a makeshift operating theater designed for purposes that transcended mere murder. Among the most disturbing discoveries were detailed anatomical drawings that appeared to be studies for future procedures. These sketches depicted various methods of skin removal, with particular attention paid to preserving the integrity of large sections. The artistic quality of these illustrations suggested someone with formal training in medical illustration, yet their content revealed a mind that had perverted scientific knowledge for purposes of unimaginable cruelty. Marginal notes indicated that the perpetrator viewed these activities as experiments, with each victim serving as a subject for testing different techniques and approaches. Dr. Rousseau's investigation revealed that the cabin had been visited multiple times before the night of the murders. Footprints in the soft earth around the dwelling showed a pattern of surveillance that had been conducted over several weeks, with particular attention paid to the couple's daily routines. The positioning of these tracks suggested someone who had studied the layout of the quarters and identified optimal times for approach and retreat. This evidence of premeditation elevated the crimes beyond spontaneous violence into the realm of calculated predation. The medical instruments found at the scene included several items that were not typically available to plantation overseers. Surgical scalpels of various sizes, bone saws designed for anatomical work, and specialized forceps suggested access to medical supply sources that would have required significant financial resources and professional connections. Dr. Rousseau noted that several of these tools bore manufacturers' marks from European companies, indicating recent acquisition through channels that remained mysterious. The preservation of tissue samples in the glass vials suggested that the perpetrator intended to continue studying his work long after its completion. The careful labeling and systematic organization of these specimens indicated someone who viewed the murders as part of a larger research project rather than isolated acts of violence. This clinical approach to human suffering revealed a mind that had completely divorced itself from normal emotional responses, treating human beings as nothing more than anatomical subjects for experimentation. The discovery of a detailed journal hidden beneath loose floorboards provided the most chilling evidence of the perpetrator's mindset. The entries, written in the same precise hand that had created the anatomical sketches, documented not only the planning and execution of these particular murders, but also references to previous subjects and future intentions. The clinical language used to describe acts of unimaginable cruelty suggested someone who had rationalized these activities as legitimate scientific endeavors rather than recognizing them as expressions of profound psychological disturbance. The journal discovered beneath the cabin's floorboards contained entries spanning nearly 18 months, beginning with Josiah Crane's arrival at Magnolia Bend and culminating in the detailed documentation of his final acts. The earliest passages revealed a mind already consumed by obsessions that had been carefully concealed beneath a veneer of professional competence. His initial observations of the enslaved population were recorded with the detached precision of a naturalist studying specimens, noting physical characteristics and behavioral patterns with scientific methodology that masked deeply disturbing intentions. Crane's background, as revealed through his private writings, differed dramatically from the credentials he had presented to Silas Beaumont. The journal indicated that he had indeed received medical training, but his studies had been terminated following incidents at a Philadelphia medical college that were described only in cryptic references to unauthorized anatomical investigations. His subsequent employment at various plantations had provided opportunities to refine techniques that legitimate medical practice would never have permitted, using enslaved individuals as unwilling subjects for experiments that served no therapeutic purpose. The systematic nature of Crane's activities became apparent through his meticulous record-keeping. Each entry documented not only his observations of potential subjects, but also detailed plans for their acquisition and utilization. The overseer had identified Celeste as a subject of particular interest within weeks of his arrival, noting her physical attributes and social position within the enslaved community with the calculating assessment of a predator selecting prey. His writings revealed that the marriage ceremony had provided the perfect opportunity to isolate both bride and groom from the protective oversight of their community. The journal's most disturbing passages described Crane's philosophical justifications for his actions. He had constructed an elaborate intellectual framework that portrayed his victims as contributions to medical science, arguing that their suffering served a greater purpose in advancing human knowledge. These rationalizations revealed a mind that had completely severed the connection between intellectual understanding and moral responsibility, transforming acts of sadistic cruelty into what he perceived as legitimate scientific research. Dr. Rousseau's analysis of the journal entries revealed patterns that suggested Crane's activities at Magnolia Bend represented an escalation rather than an initiation of his criminal behavior. References to previous subjects at other plantations indicated a trail of violence that stretched across multiple states and potentially dozens of victims. The mobility provided by his position as an overseer had allowed him to move between locations before his activities could be discovered, leaving behind a scattered pattern of unexplained deaths and disappearances that had never been connected to a single perpetrator. The technical precision described in Crane's notes indicated that his medical knowledge had continued to develop through practical application rather than formal study. His descriptions of anatomical procedures revealed innovations in technique that had been developed through repeated experimentation on living subjects. The clinical language used to document these procedures masked their true nature as acts of torture designed to maximize suffering while maintaining the subject's consciousness for as long as possible. The journal also contained detailed observations about the psychological responses of his victims, recorded with the same scientific detachment that characterized his anatomical notes. Crane had developed theories about the relationship between physical trauma and mental deterioration, using his subjects to test hypotheses about human endurance and the breaking points of psychological resistance. These experiments in applied psychology revealed a mind that viewed human suffering as raw material for intellectual exploration rather than recognizing it as evidence of his own moral corruption. The final entries in the journal, written in the days immediately following the murders of Celeste and Thomas, displayed a level of satisfaction that bordered on euphoria. Crane described these killings as his masterpiece, the culmination of years of preparation and refinement of technique. His plans for preserving and studying the specimens he had collected indicated that he viewed these murders not as an ending, but as the beginning of a new phase in his research. The journal's concluding passages revealed Crane's awareness that his activities at Magnolia Bend would likely be discovered, but also his confidence that he could escape consequences through careful planning and preparation. He had already identified his next destination, another plantation in Mississippi, where his credentials and recommendations would once again provide access to vulnerable populations. The systematic nature of his approach to relocating suggested that he had developed this pattern through previous experience, moving from location to location as circumstances required, while leaving behind a trail of victims whose deaths were attributed to disease, accident, or the general brutality of plantation life. The discovery of the murders sent shockwaves through the rigid hierarchy of Magnolia Bend, disrupting the carefully maintained order that had governed plantation life for generations. Silas Beaumont's initial reaction combined genuine horror with practical concerns about the potential impact on his remaining enslaved workforce. The systematic nature of the killings suggested a level of premeditation that made every resident of the plantation a potential target, creating an atmosphere of paranoia that threatened to undermine the discipline essential to maintaining agricultural operations during wartime. Sheriff Augustus Thibodeau arrived from the parish seat within hours of receiving word about the incident, accompanied by 2 deputies whose experience with violent crime had been limited to occasional tavern brawls and domestic disputes. The scene that greeted them in the newlyweds' cabin challenged their understanding of human nature and left them struggling to comprehend the methodical cruelty that had been inflicted upon the victims. Thibodeau, a veteran of frontier law enforcement who had witnessed the aftermath of Indian raids and river pirate attacks, found himself physically ill after examining the evidence of Crane's work. The enslaved population of Magnolia Bend had retreated into a state of collective terror that manifested itself in ways that concerned both the plantation's management and the investigating authorities. Work routines that had been maintained through decades of forced labor began to break down as fear overwhelmed the conditioning that normally ensured compliance. Groups of workers huddled together during daylight hours, refusing to venture into isolated areas of the plantation, while nights were marked by the sounds of prayers and lamentations that continued until dawn. Crane's disappearance had been discovered simultaneously with the murders, his quarters found abandoned with clear evidence of hasty departure. Personal belongings had been left behind, but items of value and all documentation related to his previous employment had vanished along with their owner. The medical instruments and anatomical texts that had aroused suspicion among the household staff were nowhere to be found, suggesting that the overseer had prioritized these tools above conventional possessions when planning his escape. The investigation revealed that Crane had been methodically preparing for his departure for several weeks before the murders occurred. Stable hands reported that he had made inquiries about river transportation to New Orleans, while merchants in the nearest town recalled unusual purchases of traveling supplies and provisions. These preparations indicated that the killings of Celeste and Thomas had been planned as his final acts at Magnolia Bend, rather than spontaneous crimes of opportunity. Dr. Rousseau's examination of Crane's abandoned quarters yielded additional evidence of the overseer's disturbed mental state. Hidden compartments revealed sketches of other enslaved individuals on the plantation, each annotated with observations about their potential suitability for future experiments. These drawings suggested that Crane had been conducting a systematic evaluation of the entire population, selecting subjects based on criteria that combined physical attributes with assessments of their social isolation and vulnerability. The physician's analysis of the medical equipment left behind indicated that Crane had been conducting preliminary experiments on animals before escalating to human subjects. Remains found in a concealed area behind his quarters included various small creatures that had been subjected to the same methodical dissection techniques later employed on his human victims. This progression from animal to human experimentation revealed a mind that had gradually overcome normal inhibitions against inflicting suffering, using increasingly complex subjects to refine his techniques. Sheriff Thibodeau's efforts to trace Crane's movements after leaving Magnolia Bend initially focused on river transportation, the most logical means of escape from the isolated plantation. Inquiries at docks along the Mississippi revealed that a man matching the overseer's description had purchased passage on a steamboat bound for New Orleans on the morning following the murders. The vessel's captain remembered the passenger primarily because of his insistence on traveling with a large trunk that he refused to allow others to handle. The trail continued through New Orleans, where dock workers recalled helping to transfer the mysterious trunk to a smaller vessel preparing to depart for ports along the Gulf Coast. The overseer's destination appeared to be Mobile, Alabama, where shipping records indicated that several plantations had recently advertised for experienced agricultural supervisors. This pattern suggested that Crane had established a network of contacts that facilitated his movement between locations, possibly including other individuals who shared his disturbed interests. The investigation's expansion beyond Louisiana's borders revealed a disturbing pattern of similar incidents at plantations where Crane had previously been employed. Local authorities in Georgia and South Carolina reported unexplained deaths among enslaved populations that had occurred during periods when the overseer had been present at nearby estates. These cases had been attributed to disease or accident at the time, but Dr. Rousseau's analysis of the available evidence suggested that they might represent earlier examples of Crane's experimental activities. The steamboat records from Mobile revealed that Crane had indeed arrived in Alabama under an assumed identity, presenting himself as Jonathan Mercer, a plantation supervisor with extensive experience in sugar cultivation. His forged credentials bore the seals of estates that had been destroyed during recent Union raids, making verification impossible and providing perfect cover for his deception. The choice of alias demonstrated the careful planning that characterized all of Crane's activities, selecting a name that would blend seamlessly into the social fabric of Confederate Alabama while obscuring his true origins. Dr. Rousseau's correspondence with medical colleagues in Mobile uncovered disturbing reports from the Riverside Plantation, located 30 miles north of the port city along the Alabama River. The estate's physician, Dr. Horatio Vance, had documented a series of unexplained deaths among the enslaved population that had begun shortly after the arrival of their new overseer. The symptoms described in these medical reports bore striking similarities to the evidence found at Magnolia Bend, suggesting that Crane had resumed his experimental activities with renewed intensity. The Riverside Plantation belonged to Colonel Jeremiah Ashworth, a Confederate officer who had been absent on military duty for most of 1862, leaving the estate's management to his elderly father and a succession of overseers. The isolation created by the colonel's absence had provided Crane with the same freedom of action that he had enjoyed in Louisiana, allowing him to establish his authority over the enslaved population without significant oversight from the plantation's owners. The pattern of exploitation and experimentation that had characterized his tenure at Magnolia Bend appeared to be repeating itself with even greater boldness. Dr. Vance's medical records indicated that the deaths at Riverside had initially been attributed to a mysterious illness that seemed to affect only certain individuals within the enslaved community. The victims had been found in their quarters with injuries that suggested violent struggle, but the systematic nature of their wounds had been overlooked in favor of explanations that blamed disease or accidents. The plantation's isolation and the general chaos of wartime had prevented proper investigation of these incidents, allowing Crane to continue his activities without interference. The correspondence between Dr. Rousseau and his Alabama colleague revealed additional details about Crane's methods that had not been apparent from the evidence at Magnolia Bend. The overseer had apparently refined his techniques, developing new approaches to his experimental procedures that reduced the likelihood of discovery while maximizing the suffering of his subjects. These innovations suggested that he viewed each location as an opportunity to advance his understanding of human anatomy and psychology through increasingly sophisticated forms of torture. Sheriff Thibodeau's investigation had expanded to include cooperation with Alabama authorities, but the challenges of interstate communication during wartime had complicated efforts to coordinate the manhunt. Telegraph lines had been disrupted by military operations, and mail service between Confederate states had become unreliable, creating delays that allowed Crane to establish himself at Riverside before word of his crimes in Louisiana could reach Alabama officials. The overseer's understanding of these communication difficulties had clearly influenced his choice of escape route and destination. The enslaved population at Riverside had begun to exhibit the same patterns of fear and social breakdown that had characterized the aftermath of the Magnolia Bend murders. Work productivity had declined dramatically as individuals refused to venture into isolated areas of the plantation, while nights were marked by the sounds of collective prayer and lamentation. These behavioral changes had been noted by the plantation's elderly patriarch, but he had attributed them to the general stress of wartime rather than recognizing them as responses to specific threats within their community. Dr. Vance's most recent reports indicated that Crane had begun to focus his attention on a young woman named Patience, whose beauty and intelligence had made her a natural leader within the enslaved community. The parallels to his selection of Celeste at Magnolia Bend were unmistakable, suggesting that the overseer followed consistent patterns in choosing his victims. The physician's growing suspicions about the true nature of the deaths at Riverside had led him to begin his own investigation, but his efforts had been hampered by the plantation's isolation and the overseer's careful concealment of evidence. The discovery of Crane's activities in Alabama provided crucial insights into his methods and motivations, but it also revealed the scope of the challenge facing law enforcement authorities. The overseer's ability to move between states and establish new identities suggested a level of organization and planning that went beyond simple criminal opportunism. His crimes appeared to be part of a larger pattern of predatory behavior that had been enabled by the social and economic structures of the antebellum South, where the lives of enslaved individuals were considered expendable and their deaths rarely investigated with the thoroughness that would have been applied to crimes against white victims. Dr. Vance's suspicions about the overseer's activities at Riverside Plantation had crystallized into certainty following his discovery of a makeshift laboratory concealed within the estate's abandoned cotton gin. The building, which had fallen into disuse following the Union blockade's disruption of cotton markets, provided Crane with the perfect location for conducting his experiments away from the scrutiny of the plantation's inhabitants. The physician's clandestine investigation revealed surgical equipment far more sophisticated than anything found at Magnolia Bend, suggesting that the overseer had used his time in Alabama to acquire additional tools and refine his techniques. The laboratory's organization reflected the methodical mind that had characterized all of Crane's activities. Anatomical charts covered the walls, annotated with observations about human physiology that had been gathered through direct experimentation rather than legitimate medical study. Glass containers filled with preserved specimens lined makeshift shelves, each labeled with dates and detailed descriptions of the procedures used to obtain them. The clinical precision of these arrangements stood in stark contrast to the horrific nature of their contents, revealing a mind that had completely divorced scientific methodology from moral consideration. Patience had disappeared from her quarters on the night of December 20th. Her absence discovered the following morning when she failed to appear for her assigned duties in the plantation's main house. The circumstances of her vanishing mirrored those that had preceded the murders at Magnolia Bend, with evidence suggesting that she had been taken from her dwelling without struggle or alarm. The overseer's careful study of the plantation's routines had allowed him to identify the optimal time and method for acquiring his chosen subject without alerting the broader community to his intentions. Dr. Vance's search of the abandoned gin building had been prompted by reports from enslaved workers who claimed to have seen lights moving within the structure during nighttime hours. The physician's investigation revealed that Crane had been using the building for several weeks, gradually transporting equipment and supplies from his quarters to create a fully functional surgical facility. The overseer's preparation for this final experiment had been even more thorough than his previous activities, suggesting that he viewed patients as the culmination of his research rather than simply another subject for study. The young woman's fate became apparent through a series of detailed notes that Crane had left behind, documenting each stage of his experimental procedures with scientific precision. These records revealed that he had kept patients alive for nearly a week, subjecting her to increasingly invasive procedures while carefully monitoring her physiological and psychological responses. The overseer's observations about the relationship between physical trauma and mental deterioration had reached new levels of sophistication, indicating that his understanding of human anatomy had continued to develop through practical application. The discovery of Patience's remains confirmed Dr. Vance's worst fears about the overseer's activities. The systematic nature of the procedures that had been performed on her body demonstrated a level of anatomical knowledge that rivaled that of trained surgeons. Yet the purpose of these interventions had been purely experimental rather than therapeutic. Crane's notes indicated that he had been testing theories about the limits of human endurance, using his subject to explore questions about consciousness and pain tolerance that legitimate medical research would never have attempted to answer. The physician's investigation also revealed that Crane had been corresponding with unknown associates, exchanging detailed descriptions of his experimental techniques and results. These letters, found hidden within the gin building, suggested the existence of a network of individuals who shared the overseer's disturbed interests and were actively collaborating in the development of new approaches to human experimentation. The implications of this discovery extended far beyond the crimes committed at individual plantations, indicating that Crane's activities were part of a larger pattern of organized predatory behavior. The overseer's final departure from Riverside Plantation had been as carefully planned as his previous escapes, with evidence suggesting that he had been preparing for his next relocation even while conducting his experiments on patients. Shipping records from Mobile indicated that a man matching Crane's description had booked passage on a vessel bound for Charleston, South Carolina, carrying the same mysterious trunk that had accompanied him from Louisiana. The pattern of his movements suggested a predetermined route that would take him to locations where his credentials and recommendations would once again provide access to vulnerable populations. Dr. Vance's urgent communications with authorities in South Carolina had been delayed by the same wartime disruptions that had hampered previous efforts to track the overseer's movements. The physician's detailed descriptions of Crane's methods and the evidence of his crimes had been transmitted through military channels, but the chaos of ongoing military operations had prevented timely delivery of these warnings to civilian law enforcement officials. The trail of Josiah Crane ended abruptly in Charleston, South Carolina, where shipping records indicated his arrival in early January 1863, but no subsequent documentation of his departure or activities could be located despite extensive investigation by local authorities. The mysterious trunk that had accompanied him throughout his journey from Louisiana had been observed by dock workers during his disembarkation, but inquiries about his destination yielded only vague recollections of a well-dressed gentleman who had spoken of agricultural opportunities in the Carolina Low Country. The overseer's ability to blend seamlessly into the social fabric of each new location had once again served him well, allowing him to disappear into the chaos of a region increasingly disrupted by military operations. Dr. Rousseau's final report on the case, submitted to Louisiana authorities in March 1863, concluded that Crane represented a new category of criminal whose activities transcended the conventional understanding of murder and violence. The physician's analysis of the evidence from multiple locations had revealed patterns of behavior that suggested a mind capable of rationalizing extreme cruelty through pseudo-scientific justification. The systematic nature of the overseer's crimes, combined with his apparent network of associates, indicated that his activities were part of a larger phenomenon that had been enabled by the social structures of the antebellum South. The investigation's expansion had revealed additional cases that bore similarities to Crane's documented crimes, suggesting that his influence extended beyond his direct activities to inspire others with similar inclinations. Reports from plantations across the Confederacy described unexplained deaths and disappearances that followed patterns consistent with the overseer's methods, indicating that his techniques and philosophies had been disseminated through the correspondence network discovered at Riverside Plantation. The scope of this influence raised disturbing questions about the number of individuals who might have been inspired to pursue similar experimental activities. The enslaved communities that had survived Crane's presence bore psychological scars that persisted long after his departure. At Magnolia Bend, the quarters where Celeste and Thomas had lived remained abandoned, avoided by residents who reported strange sounds and unexplained phenomena in the area. Similar patterns of avoidance and fear were documented at Riverside Plantation, where the abandoned gin building was eventually destroyed by fire under circumstances that local authorities deemed suspicious, but never fully investigated. The war's progression had ultimately rendered the manhunt for Crane a secondary priority as military concerns consumed the resources of law enforcement agencies throughout the Confederacy. Sherman's march through Georgia and the Carolinas had disrupted communication networks and displaced populations, creating conditions that would have allowed the overseer to disappear completely or assume yet another identity in a different region. The collapse of the plantation system itself had eliminated the social structures that had enabled his crimes, but it had also removed the possibility of tracking his continued activities through institutional records. Post-war investigations conducted by federal authorities had uncovered additional evidence of Crane's network, including correspondence that suggested his associates had continued their activities even after his disappearance. These documents, discovered in the ruins of plantation houses throughout the former Confederacy, revealed a disturbing subculture of individuals who had used the institution of slavery as cover for pursuing their own twisted interests in human experimentation. The systematic destruction of records during the war's final months had prevented comprehensive investigation of this network's full extent. The ultimate fate of Josiah Crane remained unknown, with theories ranging from death during military action to successful escape to foreign countries where his particular skills might have found new applications. Some investigators suggested that he had joined the exodus of Confederate sympathizers to Brazil, where slavery remained legal and plantation agriculture continued to provide opportunities for exploitation. Others believed that he had simply assumed a new identity within the United States, possibly continuing his activities in regions where the disruption of war had created ideal conditions for predatory behavior. The case files, sealed by federal authorities in 1867, contained a final notation by Dr. Rousseau warning that individuals like Crane represented an ongoing threat to society that transcended the specific circumstances of the antebellum period. The physician's prescient observation that such predators would adapt their methods to exploit whatever social structures provided access to vulnerable populations proved tragically accurate in subsequent decades, as similar cases emerged in different contexts throughout the post-war era. Thank you for joining us for another episode of Sinister Memory. If you enjoyed today's investigation, subscribe to our channel and ring the notification bell to be alerted when we unveil our next dark chronicle. Share your thoughts about this case in the comments below. We read every single one, and your ideas often lead us to our next investigation. Until next time.